Hello, Grandpa here. I thought I would tell you a story today. This is one about an accident that I had. When you look at a snake, you can tell if it's poisonous by the head and the tail. Rattlesnakes have blunt tails that look like the end of a fat finger. Other snakes have long tapering tails that get smaller almost forever until they end in a tiny point. The head of a rattlesnake has puffed out cheeks and a square nose, kind of like a heart with the tip cut off. Some other snakes have this type of head, like the gopher snake, but others have heads that look like the end of a broom handle. You can hardly tell where the head ends and the body begins. If you see a snake that has a blunt tail and the cheeky head, beware. It will get you into trouble. But if you're smart, you'll never touch a snake. In May, the snakes come out of hibernation, or long winter sleep, and shed their skin. They go blind as they shed and will strike at anything warm that comes too close. They don't have to see you, they can sense your body heat. Baby rattlesnakes have smaller venom sacs, but their poison is more powerful. Some say that a baby snake will give you all its poison where an adult will not. If I was an adult rattlesnake and big human being came by and wanted to grab a hold of me, I think I'd give him everything I've got. Ounce per ounce, in comparison, the baby snake has a more potent venom. It's stronger. A strange thing happens to most boys at 12 years old. Some wake up to realize that they are in school and just might be interesting to learn something. Such was the case with me. I moved to a new school in kindergarten, at the end of 5th grade, and again at the end of 6th grade. This is usually too much, but at this last school I gained friends quickly and began to get very comfortable. My grades weren't good at all up to this year. Mr. Letha, my social studies teacher, made a point to teach his students a lesson in respect. He wanted them to learn how to pronounce his name. This he did to the point that everyone knew he was very serious about it. One day a boy called him by saying, "Hey, Joe," then giggled. Mr. Letha took the young man out of the classroom and had a talk with him. The look on the boy's face when he came in taught us that we would learn that name and always use it correctly. You would too. That very day, the teacher asked me a question from the chapter assigned the day before. I didn't have the answer. Mr. Letha asked me if I had read the chapter. No, I replied. Cringing, I waited for a lecture. All Mr. Letha said was, "You seem to be going nowhere fast." That bothered me a great deal. Needless to say, I learned the value of study that very night. The next day I had every answer and gave the correct one when asked. "This young man learns from his mistakes. He is going somewhere," said the teacher. I wasn't cringing anymore. I was smiling. After that, I did very well in my studies. At the end of the first trimester, I was surprised to hear my name on the school announcements. "What was that they said?" I asked a friend. "You made honor roll and principal's honor roll." Wow. That was 7th grade. That year I won an essay contest put on by the PTA. Now my English teacher, Miss Disney, encouraged me to write a speech for the upcoming 8th grade graduation. I entered it and won. I had the same science teacher in 8th grade that I had in 7th. Mr. Doherty was also my homeroom teacher. My good friend Scott Taylor was with me in the same class. He was a member of the church, and we spent some good times together. We decided to share a science project toward the end of the school year. Scratching our heads for an idea, I remembered the time another friend took me to San Dimas Canyon Park. This friend and I actually went up a canyon behind the park where he said we would find a lot of snakes. He was looking for rattlesnakes. He caught them, bagged them, and sold them to a professor who milked them for their poison. He had a stick that forked at the end like a Y. The two ends had holes. The string had a large knot. The other end was poked through one hole and then the other, and came all the way up to the place where you hold onto the stick. He would stretch out the string in between the two ends to make a loop. When he found a snake, he would loop this over the snake's head and pull the string tight to hold the head safely away from him. He would then put the snake in a pillowcase. He would loose the string and take the loop off its head. I asked him if it was safe to have this pillowcase with a snake inside bouncing off his leg as he rode his bike down the hill. He said they couldn't strike while they were in the bag. Problem was, he dropped the bag and the snake started to get out. We were jumping wildly to get out of the way of this thing before he was able to pick it up and put it back in the bag again. I thought this was totally ridiculous and extremely dangerous. I wanted nothing to do with rattlesnakes. The only problem was I was not careful enough. I told my friend Scott that I knew of a place where we could find a snake. We could demonstrate how a snake swallows its food by taking a movie or pictures. Scott thought that was a great idea. We made plans to ride our bikes to the canyon behind the park the following Saturday. I had a small pet gopher snake, about 8 inches long. I got it when I went to that canyon with my other friend. It was too small for our experiment. It had bit me the day before on my left hand. The bite made a horseshoe shape cut because it had a row of tiny teeth around its jaw. I didn't have a band-aid on it, and it was very visible on the index finger. I had packed a lunch since we were traveling 5 miles to San Dimas Canyon Park. We would have to be home before dark, so it would take all that morning and afternoon. Scott pulled up in the driveway and asked if I was ready to go. At that moment, Mother came out on the porch. She had a kind of puzzled look on her face. She said these words, "Randy, if you go to San Dimas Canyon Park, stay in the park, or you'll be bit by a rattlesnake." I can clearly remember how shocked I was at what she said. I asked myself, how in the world did she know I was going to San Dimas Canyon Park? Why did she say I might get bit by a rattlesnake? She didn't know that Scott and I were going to look for a snake. It was weird, but the look on her face was something I'll never forget. Back in those days, I could jump on my bike and go anywhere without asking. She just didn't have to know everything I did. She trusted me and my friend, and it wasn't such a scary time like it is today. Here's where I should have known better. Mothers have a kind of feeling of what might happen to their children. Back then I thought it could be a guess or that she read my mind, but I know this now. It was the Spirit of God. God blesses mothers to know a lot about their children and when to worry. I'm telling you, this is true. I told her, "Okay, Mom," and off we went. We rode our bikes to the park, and the road forked. One way in front of the park, the other way up the side and into another canyon. Just as so many young people do, I ignored my mother. But I still thought it was strange that she knew so much. I hope someday you get to visit this park. It's so beautiful. It had a wonderful grassy lawns spotted with huge oak and sycamore trees. It was an old park that must have been around as long as my school. That school was made of adobe and is now over 125 years old. I led Scott to the canyon behind the park. The road followed a stream on the left for a ways. At one point you can turn left onto a dirt road. That road was blocked so that cars could not enter. It's still blocked to this day. We parked our bikes and walked down to the stream, then upstream in this tiny ravine. We arrived at the point where my other friend had shown me this snake heaven. We weren't disappointed. As we scanned around, both of us spotted at the same time what looked like the body of a snake. It had colorful stripes wrapping around its body. It looked to me like a king snake. As we both pointed, one of us said, "Race you to it." Unfortunately for me and fortunately for Scott, I got there first. I hurriedly grabbed the snake, but immediately felt a sharp poke on my finger and pulled my hand out. I could not believe it. On the top of the index finger of my right hand was a tiny dot of blood. On the side of my middle finger, closest to my index finger, I had a scrape, about a 1/4 inch long. When I closed my fingers together, I had that red dot on the top of my index finger and a red dot right in between the two fingers. The dots were about a 1/4 inch apart. I looked down at my left hand and saw the bite from the gopher snake that I had. Again, it was a horseshoe shape because of the tiny little teeth around its jaw. I looked again at my right hand. Very different. It was fang marks. The first thought I had was that I had been tricked. I turned to Scott and told him that I had been bitten by a rattlesnake. This he thought was ridiculous. Instead, he was upset that I had let the snake go. We both looked at the place where the snake had been. We had seen the middle of its body between two large boulders. We had not seen the head or the tail of the snake. At that very moment, a snake about 8 inches long crawled out from behind those boulders, traveled about 2 feet, and popped into a hole in the ground. We had now seen the head and the tail. There was no doubt I had been bitten by a rattlesnake. I wanted to go home. I wanted to be with my family. I wanted to eat dinner and watch television that night. I didn't want to have to go to the hospital. I knew, however, that that was exactly what I had to do. It shocked me. Please, I just want to go home. Scott argued with me, there's no way that was a rattlesnake. After a while I convinced him, showing him my hand and explaining what a rattlesnake looks like. But it puzzled me that it had stripes and not diamond shapes on its body. I think Scott offered to go get help or even carry me down the hill. I told him that we should just get on the bicycles and go down to the park. There would be someone there that could help us. I was able to ride my bike without holding my handlebars, and I didn't have to pedal because it was downhill. I was taught in Boy Scouts about the use of a tourniquet, where you pretty much cut off the flow of blood to your hand or foot. You take a belt or handkerchief, wrap it around your arm or leg, tie it, poke a stick through it, and twist. There was another way to restrict the flow of the blood. It was called a pressure bandage. I was able to wrap my left hand, thumb, and index finger tightly around my right wrist. I kept hold tightly until I got help. We came to the buildings where the park attendants were. I knocked on the first door I came to, and a man answered it. I told him that I had been bitten by a rattlesnake. He said, "Yeah, sure, kid, everybody thinks they've been bit by a rattlesnake. Go home." I told him that if he didn't help me, I would find somebody who would. This made him pause, and he told me that he would call an ambulance. He told me to walk down the hill to a building that had a chain link fence around it. He told me to sit on the bench there and wait. There was no bench there today, just the building and the chain link fence with a gate in it. I don't know about Scott, but I was sure I was in shock. At least I felt horrible and lightheaded. After a bit, a little boy ran up, out of breath, and said that there was a big snake in the middle of the park. Scott took off with him and found a large gopher snake that would have been perfect for our project. If I had listened to my mother and stayed in the park, I would be traveling home now to have dinner and watch TV with my family. How did my mother know? It turns out that the park attendant did not call for an ambulance. He called the forest rangers, who then called an ambulance. They knew better not to mess around with the possibility of a rattlesnake bite. The ambulance pulled in and the paramedics put me on a gurney, a rolling bed. For my safety, they had to strap my arms down to my sides. After a few minutes, my hands started to swell to the size of a softball. The park attendant came over, looked at my hand, and went white as a sheet. Scott rode his bike, rolled my bike beside his, and went home. It took us about 30 minutes to get to the Glendora Hospital in an ambulance. The paramedics were great and even asked me if I wanted them to turn on the siren. I said yes, so they turned it on, but it didn't help much. They radioed the hospital to have them call my parents. As they pulled me into the emergency room, I saw a woman and a boy who must have been involved in a car accident. They rolled them out of the way and put me in the middle under the lights. That made me understand that this was a very serious situation. They put my hand into a large bowl of ice water. That hurt, but they told me I had to keep it in there. This was to slow down the poison from traveling to the rest of my body. They gave me 18 anti-venom shots. 6 in one arm, 6 in the other arm, and 6 in the rear. I can see to this day the look on my parents' face when they came into the emergency room. No child should see their parents so afraid and shocked. Funny, but I was not crying or even really that afraid. I told them not to worry, that I would be all right. I wasn't brave or heroic, just anxious to calm them down. I guess I needed them to be unafraid somehow. After that, I remembered nothing until the next morning. That day was kind of blurry. They said I had gone into anaphylactic shock. They get antivenom by scratching rattlesnake venom onto a horse's hide. The horse then creates antibodies in its blood to fight the poison. They take those antibodies and put them in the bodies of people bitten by rattlesnakes. Hopefully, they will stop the poison from hurting you. Supposedly, this antivenom covered a range of different kinds of rattlesnakes. However, I evidently was allergic to horses, or something else went wrong. This is a little bit about the Pacific rattler. It has become known as the people-biting snake in California, said Loma Linda University Medical Center's Dr. Sean Bush. The southern Pacific rattlesnake is one of the rare kinds of rattlesnakes which lives across much of the western United States, Mexico, and Canada. Like its relatives, the southern Pacific rattlesnake has a relatively hefty body and stubby tail, a triangular-shaped head, hooded eyes, and oval-shaped pupils for its eyes. The southern Pacific rattler has a small opening or heat-sensing organ on each side of its face, between its nostrils and eyes, making it what we call a pit viper. Using the heat-sensing organs on the sides of its face, even in total darkness, the snake can, according to the San Diego Zoo, detect nearby prey. It can strike quite far. Oftentimes its bite does not cause immediate death. The snake typically follows its wounded and struggling victim by using its sight, its forked tongue, and heat sensor. The venom in the Pacific southern rattlesnake is unique. Most rattlesnakes have a venom that primarily acts as a blood poison. This means it attacks the victim's blood cells. It causes rapid bruising, swelling, and pain at the site of the bite. The southern Pacific rattler, however, has a venom that rapidly attacks the victim's nervous system, possibly triggering problems in breathing, loss of muscle control, and can cause the victim to collapse into a coma. We are, said Sean Bush, only now learning how potent and varied rattlesnake venom can be. A rattlesnake's head just severed from its body can still bare its fangs and bite, said Howard. The heat sensors will still be functioning and the warmth of the hand will make it strike. Wow. Pretty scary, huh? They laid me in bed with my right arm resting on a table. They put a trash bag full of crushed ice on my arm and another bag on top, up to my elbow. This was to slow down the poison from spreading to the rest of my body. My 8th grade graduation came and went. The principal gave my graduation speech. I had lots of cards and letters from friends at school. I didn't have a lot of family visitors because they wouldn't let them in. I did look out the window one day to find some of my family smiling and waving. They held up a poodle and pointed at it and then at me. I remember wondering why they would give me a poodle of all the dogs in the world. One day the doctor told me he was going to take the bags of ice off my arm. They had been on there a whole month. He and a couple of nurses took the bags off and then stood there staring at me as if something was about to happen. Then it happened. My arm felt like somebody had poured gasoline on it and lit it on fire. I passed out, and to my horror, when I woke up, the bags were on my hand again. That meant that I was going to have to go through that ordeal again. It wasn't so bad, though, the second time, and I tolerated it without passing out. My fingertips and fingernails had turned blue, except for my index finger and my thumb. I had huge red blisters all over my hand. The doctor used a syringe to suck out the fluid and collapse the blisters. The poison had eaten through the skin to the point where I could not grow new skin again. Something strange started to happen. Mom would start crying for no reason, and sometimes I would see her in the hallway talking to the doctor. She would then cover her face with her hands, obviously crying. My young mind told me that I was going to die. I could tell that after a day or two of this, they were finally going to tell me the bad news. That's what happened, but I was very surprised to see my Uncle Herman coming in to talk to me. Were they really going to have my uncle give me the bad news? He lifted his hand that had the index finger cut off at the first knuckle and asked me if I remembered him telling me how it happened. He had told me several different versions of how this happened. It was either shot off or blown off or something like that. He said that he had never really told me the true story. It had been a silly accident, he said. He was hammering some sheet metal with a heavy hammer and accidentally smashed his finger to the point where they had to cut part of it off. In a very understanding and sympathetic way, he told me that they might have to cut off parts of my fingers. I said, then I'm not going to die? No, of course not. You're not going to die. I was utterly overjoyed. What a relief. They transferred me to Los Angeles Orthopedic Hospital. It was there that they amputated my 3 fingers. They started at the tip of the finger and worked their way down until they came to healthy tissue and bone. It turned out that they had to cut below the lowest knuckles of my hand. It was a miracle that my index finger had just enough healthy skin all the way to the fingertip to survive. My thumb had a strange blister full of yellow fluid and somehow was able to avoid the knife. They then had the problem of putting new skin on the back of my hand and most of my index finger. They tried a new machine that did nothing more than scrape my stomach raw on one side. They also decided they needed padding for the ends of the bones that had been cut. They cut a flap of skin loose from my stomach about a 1/4 inch deep, tucked my hand in there, and sewed it to the back of my hand. Another flap was cut, draped over my index finger, and sewn down. The flaps were still connected to my stomach and stayed that way for 2 weeks. I looked like Napoleon with his hand tucked in his shirt. For some crazy reason, the doctors decided that I might go home for a weekend right after this. I was pretty healthy in my whole stay in the hospital, but I had to go home that weekend with my hand sewed to my stomach. That was interesting, especially going to church. After this, they cut the flap loose and sewed the loose part to the under part of my hand, over the end of the bones. They cut the flap over my index finger and sewed it down to the bottom of my finger. I now had 2 large holes in my stomach, exposing the muscles underneath. They had to pull skin in to cover those holes. So they cut from the holes outward to my upper right, bottom right, upper left, bottom left, and pulled those sections of skin in toward my stomach and sewed it with aluminum stitches. This left me bent over. The doctors told me that I needed to try and straighten up. This would pull on the metal stitches that would tear the skin. The tear would then heal and form scar tissue. I had to tear and heal, and build up more and more scar tissue to form wide scars to fill in the holes in my skin. This was Los Angeles in August of 1965. It was during the Watts riots. Some people in LA were very upset with the way they were treated, so they decided to destroy their own town. Some broke into businesses and stole things. They burned buildings and hurt people. The town was declared off limits for everybody except the police and firemen. The hospital is practically in the middle of all of this. We lived about 30 miles out of town, and it was too dangerous for Mom to come to the hospital. Doctors, nurses, and other people who worked at the hospital didn't want to come in. This left many patients alone in their rooms, with just a few nurses to take care of them. After these operations, they gave me 3 days of strong shots for the pain and then sleeping pills for the night. I had only 1 shot and then no sleeping pills because of the riots. One day I didn't see anybody at all. All the electricity was out, so there was no television and no air conditioning. I didn't even get anything to eat or drink. At night, when I couldn't get to sleep because of the pain, I started pressing the button that would call the nurse. After several attempts to get someone to come, a nurse came in, grabbed the button that was on a cord attached to the wall, and ripped it out. She didn't explain anything, just ran out of the room. I realized that I was not serious enough to get attention from the very few nurses available. There was some pain, but mostly terrible itching. They put heavy bandages over my metal stitches in my stomach and wrapped the tape around my whole body. We found out that I was allergic to the tape. It created welts and big sores where the tape had been. They tried a non-allergenic tape, but it wouldn't stick to my skin. After that, I just had a big cloth pad lying on top of the metal stitches. Whenever I moved, the cloth would catch on the stitches. That and the raw skin on my side itched horribly. The room had gotten really hot, and the sweat rolled into the places where the stitches were cutting and started to sting. I was so miserable. I remember praying and praying to God that He would just let me fall asleep. It seemed like I was awake for hours, but I finally fell asleep. When I woke up, Mother and the doctor were there. The doctor was very unhappy and apologized. My mother looked horribly worried. The doctor was so upset and worried that I wondered what had happened after I fell asleep. I even wondered for a while if I'd gone out of my head. One day a lady came in and said that I might be able to go to a Dodger baseball game because the money made at the game would go to help build another addition to the hospital. She was looking for patients who could travel from the hospital and stay for the game. I explained that I could, and she made arrangements for my dad and I to go. They took us in a bus to Dodger Stadium and then down to the field. We met the players, the managers, and even the announcers. I got several autographs. This turned out to be the year that the Dodgers won the World Series. Two very famous players were Don Drysdale and Sandy Koufax. They put each of the patients on a position of the field with a player. I got to go to first base with Wes Parker. He was not only a famous Dodger, but also a TV actor. On the Brady Bunch, he played the boyfriend of Greg's school teacher. Greg was telling his teacher that he wanted to play baseball instead of going to college. He meets Wes Parker, who plays himself, who talks Greg into the necessity of going to college. Wes told me that his family had a ranch in Montana. One day he stepped off his horse and immediately a rattlesnake struck his boot. He said it scared him to death. He told me that he wouldn't promise anything, but that he would try to hit a home run for me. He had the only home run in the game in the second inning. My dad literally fell off the bench that we were sitting on because he was so surprised. I had been in the hospital since May 22nd. It was now September and I wanted to go home. My doctor said things were going well and I should go home the next day. That next morning, however, he told me that I had lost too much blood from the operations and needed a transfusion. This is where they give you somebody else's blood. It was incredible to see my pale face, my pale white skin turn rosy pink. They actually let me get out of bed and walk around. I took the elevator down to the lobby. It was neat to see that front door. They had a big display on the table of the city of Paris with the Eiffel Tower and old-time touring cars. A big sign explained that a new motion picture called The Great Race was now in theaters. The famous actors were Jack Lemmon, Tony Curtis, and Natalie Wood. It looked like it would be a real fun comedy about a race from New York to Paris by car in the early 1900s. I asked Mom if we could go see it when I got out of the hospital. When they finally let me go, in my pajamas, we went to a drive-in movie to see The Great Race. I sat in the back of our 1964 Chevy Bel Air, eating a chili dog with mustard and drinking a large Coca-Cola. I sincerely wish that you would learn from this video and be careful and always listen to your mother. She wants you to be happy, safe, and follow Heavenly Father because that's the only true way to be happy in this life and beyond. Heavenly Father whispered to my mom to warn me, pure and simple, that I would be bitten by a rattlesnake if I went outside the park. 3 months of suffering happened because I disobeyed my mother. We're only on this earth for a short time, but we're blessed to know that we come from a heavenly family. We must return there for eternal happiness and joy. We can be happy here on earth only if we obey His warnings. If you want to know if this is true, get down on your knees and ask Heavenly Father. Ask Him all you want to know. Ask Him if He loves you, and He will answer you. And I love you too. God bless you.